That's long. Yeah, I get these
So shall we
messages.
start the session?
Sure, sure.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, sure. I'm ready.
Welcome one and all. So we begin the 3-day international conference on the theory and discursive practices in the age of interdisciplinarity with with our first keynote by Professor Dilip Kumar Das of EFLU Hyderabad. So we have designed this talk titled Interdisciplinarity as a Critical Practice as an overview to the central theme of the conference. And he'll also walk us through the basics of some of the concepts. Um, Professor Dilip Kumar Das works at the Department of Culture Studies, School of Interdisciplinary Studies, EFL University, Hyderabad. His areas of specialization include critical medical humanities and body culture studies. He has published in these areas at both national and international levels. His latest, his latest being a book on AIDS awareness campaigns titled Teaching AIDS, the Cultural Politics of HIV Disease in India, published by Springer Nature Singapore in 2019. And Epidemic Narratives, Two Paradigms, forthcoming in a critical anthology, also published by Springer. Professor Das was a Fulbright postdoctoral fellow at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and a South Asia Regional Fellow of Social Science Research Council, New York. He has supervised interdisciplinary doctoral work in diverse areas, including cultural geography, critical museum studies, food culture studies, and media studies. I would like to add a personal note to this otherwise very formal welcome speech. I was a student of Professor Das during my master's, and I remember that I did not initially sign up for his course because I thought it would go too much over my head. And later we started getting feedback and comments on campus about how amazing his sessions are. And then I couldn't resist myself from signing up for his course. I remember this must have been in 2013, and it was a course titled Biopolitics. And ever since then, I've not stopped being a student of his till date. Even in my recent role as a teacher, whenever I find it difficult to get across certain ideas to students, I go to Professor Dilip. Uh, because and the topic ranges from how to get your punctuations right, from to wrapping your head around the concept of heterotopia. Professor Das is affectionately called as DKD by his student community. And the best thing about his sessions, I feel, is its interdisciplinary nature. I still remember how, while teaching biopolitics, along with Foucault and Agamben, he brought in the juridical aspects of the biopolitics by looking at a legal battle between an AIDS patient and the Union of India. Another instance would be how, while teaching medical humanities, he was helping us understand the discourses on illness by looking at traditions of certain type of mother goddess worship, Mariamman and the like in the southern states of India. Secondly, to me, it looks like as much as he is a thinker, he is an effective teacher, even to the uninitiated. And that's not an easy combination for someone who reigns in the higher realms of thought to step down to us lesser mortals and break down difficult concepts and walk us through the basics of it. And he's able to do it because he prepares and reads up so well for each of his lectures. He must have taught for many more years than I've ever lived on the face of earth. But I was mind blown when I actually saw how much he prepares for each session of us. Even as yesterday, I had the chance to go through the detailed notes that he prepared for this particular keynote. It came up to 11 pages almost. And I assure you that all of us are in for not just food for thought, but feast for thought. It was so nice of you to do all this for us, sir. And again, after my master's, I had the fortune, rather, he had the misfortune of being my PhD supervisor. And I was probably his most disobedient and irreverent student. But before he committed to this keynote, we had a truce signed that we are not going to pull each other's leg in public. because he violated it earlier, I feel free to do it now, and I think I've embarrassed him enough right now, and I should stop right here. Sir, welcome to Bharat Mata
Thank
College,
you. Thank you.
and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Uh, Let me begin by thanking Dr. Mimi Abraham, Dr. Chitra, and the organizers of this international conference on theory and discursive practices in the age of interdisciplinarity. I also thank Dr. Rose Sebastian, my student who has taught me many things. And among them, I think she mentioned that indiscipline as a mode of interdisciplinarity. So with that, thank you very much, Rose, for the very flattering introduction you've given. You've made my task more difficult because now I have to live up to the expectations you have raised. Let's hope I do. Uh, yeah, I feel very nervous after the introduction that you have given. I will speak on interdisciplinarity, given that we all, or at least most of us, belong to the field of the humanities. I'll speak on interdisciplinarity from a humanities perspective. What role can the humanities have in what we have called this age of interdisciplinarity? In the first section of my talk, I will explain the concepts of disciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, and interdisciplinarity, ending with what I mean by interdisciplinarity in critical practice. I will then interpret a recent novel from Kerala, published just a few years back, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this novel, S. Harish's Misha, or Mustache in English translation, as a text about space and the discourse of cartography. My second example is a 2008 Supreme Court judgment titled Dhirendra Pandwa versus the state of Orissa, which I will read as we would a literary text. In both examples, I will try to demonstrate how literary studies can enable us to critique what are called the human sciences, or often called the sciences of man, to open up new insights into the relations between knowledge, culture, and power. The word discipline, as Michel Foucault reminds us, has two meanings. It refers to a domain of knowledge, such as geography or jurisprudence, the two domains we will be looking at. But it also refers to a technique of power that normalizes. As domains of knowledge, disciplines are founded on norms that govern their objects, concepts, and the methods of study that are proper to them, which define them and give them their privileged access to truth. The disciplines emerged in modern Europe as a response to the need to classify, to order the things of this world into well-bounded categories that could then be studied with precision. Disciplines define themselves on the boundaries they set up in identifying their objects of study. To take a recent example with which many of you may already be familiar, that is how the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure begins his course in general linguistics, in which he proposes the scientific study of language as human practice. Saussure begins by defining the object of linguistic science, which is not specific languages like Korea or Malayalam, but the structure of language in general. He then explains what kind of questions this object permits us to ask and what questions are irrelevant to it, what methods are used to study it, and what its scope is. The first 7 chapters of the course, therefore, are devoted to the task of delimiting the objects, methods, and relevance of this new discipline. I have chosen Saussure's book as an example because it shows how disciplines are constituted at their origin as normative practices of knowledge. The disciplines, however, do not bear to power only an internal relationship. That is, the delimitation of fields, the setting down of norms, structuring forms of authority and accreditation, and formulating rules that determine what is proper and legitimate and what improper and to be ruled out as inauthentic knowledge. Foucault, in fact, was interested in a particular form of disciplinarity that emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, the human sciences. They emerged in response to the new political techniques that he calls governmentality, a mode of exercise of power that needs to know all about the subjects it rules, how they live and labor, what things they need, their birth and death rates, their interests and motives. And I quote from Foucault, quote, the historical emergence of each of these human sciences, he wrote in The Order of Things, was occasioned by a problem, a requirement, an obstacle of a theoretical or practical order, unquote. Psychology developed as a science in response to conditions of industrialization and urbanization, and sociology in response to the social imbalances of 19th century Europe. To these, we may add anthropology, which emerged in Europe's colonies in response to the necessities of rule. A very apt example is the ethnographic work on the Nagas by J.P. Mills and J.H. Hutton in the 19th century, which, as Abraham Lotha has pointed out, was the outcome of, and I quote Lotha, an intimate collaboration between science and colonial administration, unquote. Mills and Hutton, who wrote extensively on Naga tribes like the Aos, Angamis, Rengmas, and Semas, were ICS officers, Indian Civil Service officers, posted in the hills, charged with the task of pacifying these tribes. After they retired from administrative service, Mills became the president of the Royal Anthropological Society, while Hutton was appointed professor of social anthropology at Cambridge. Knowledge, declared Foucault in an interview in 1977, and I quote, is linked in a circular relation with systems of power which produce and sustain it, and to effects of power which it induces and which extend it, unquote. That is, the exercise of governmental power requires the production of knowledge about those it governs, which in turn enables the formation of new techniques of power. Foucault's term for this linkage is well known, pouvoir savoir, or power knowledge. The work of Mills and Hutton not only marks the moment of anthropology's emergence as a human science, it also reveals the power relations within which it emerged. As formations of power, disciplines guard against any transgression of their boundaries. In their introduction to disciplinarity and dissent in cultural studies, Carrie Nelson and Dilip Gaonkar recounts the story of an associate professor of English at the University of Illinois who wrote a book on the cultural history of America's atomic bomb project. The book was acclaimed as a masterpiece of interdisciplinary work. But when its author sought promotion to full professorship, he was denied because his work did not conform to disciplinary norms. Nelson and Gaonkar write, and I quote, "It was fine for Davis to take on physics as a hobby, but it could not be professionally recognized. Physics was in a different building, past the remnants of another sort of disciplinary blindness. The stumps of elm trees clustered together on the campus's central square in unthinking, vulnerable, and, as it happened, entirely mortal monoculture." Unquote. Disciplines are not just monocultural, they police their boundaries as fiercely as cultures of dominance do. This disciplinary border labor, writes Vincent Leach, quote, entails protecting the inside from the outside, ensuring the distinctiveness of the disciplines, and thereby solidifying the division of knowledges. Disciplinarity is not just an epistemological norm or a norm for the pursuit of knowledge, but equally a norm of professional conduct. But borders, as Gloria Anzaldúa reminds us, are notoriously permeable. She writes in Borderlands, and I quote, "The skin of the earth is seamless. The sea cannot be fenced. El Mar, that is the sea, does not stop at the borders." Unquote. As with national borders, so with disciplinary borders. They provoke questions that, like illegal migrants, respect no lines that we impose on them. Or, to come home, like the floodwaters of Chitrapuha that recently inundated Trikakara, they breach them relentlessly. This is especially so in the human sciences, as Ferdinand de Saussure perhaps feared while defending his science of language. Human social phenomena are too multifaceted, too heterogeneous, to be limited to particular perspectives and insights. Certain questions demand answers that cut across disciplinary boundaries and generate new insights in their convergence. The convergence of disciplines is not a recent phenomenon. What is recent is such convergence as and I emphasize this, as a methodological principle, which emerges only in the second half of the 20th century. Newell Farr Davis's Lawrence and Oppenheimer, the book that Nelson and Gaonkar cite as a pioneering interdisciplinary project, could only be possible in the 1960s, when the politics of knowledge and the links between disciplines and social power began to be recognized as legitimate subjects of research. Foucault's work of this period, especially Madness and Civilization, The Birth of the Clinic, and The Archaeology of Knowledge, provided the outlines of a methodology for such interdisciplinary studies. The contemporary convergence of disciplines has, broadly speaking, taken two forms. One is multidisciplinarity, which, as Donald Richards defines it, quote, brings together the tools and insights of two or more academic disciplines to examine some issue, problem, or phenomenon of joint concern, unquote. The tools and insights, however, work within disciplinary boundaries, and multidisciplinary approaches merely juxtapose and contrast their various contributions. The other form of convergence, more recent than multidisciplinarity, is the interdisciplinary approach. To cite Richards again, quote, it is the ability to identify and illuminate the connections between disciplinary insights and materials, unquote. Interdisciplinarity attempts to synthesize the insights from various disciplines into a holistic perspective, even as it recognizes their insuperable differences. To put it succinctly, multidisciplinarity emphasizes convergence, while interdisciplinarity synthesizes by emphasizing difference. Richards' argument, however, is that true synthesis is impossible, given the gaps between the fundamental assumptions of the disciplines concerned, especially between the human sciences and the humanities. Quote, there would seem to be unbreachable epistemological barriers preventing genuine integration in such cases, unquote. What Richards offers instead is not integration, but what he calls, quote unquote, interdisciplinary connections, which in his view will yield an enriched, though disaggregated, understanding of the objects. Phenomena in the world are the outcome of complex and contingent events, which cannot be reduced to either a singular perspective or a synthetic one, and we need diverse, if incompatible, insights into them. Interdisciplinarity, and here I come to my claim, interdisciplinarity, however, need not be either a synthesis or connection. It can intervene in disciplines to question their limits, to pose questions that exceed their disciplinary boundaries. Interdisciplinarity, in this strong sense, is indisciplinarity. The questions it poses are illegitimate from a disciplinary perspective, its methods improper and against all rules of propriety. Interdisciplinarity as indiscipline. Rose understands me best. I call this approach critical interdisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity as epistemological critique. Foucault once explained the relation between critique and knowledge in a talk that he gave to the French Society of Philosophy. Critique, he said, asks of knowledge, and I quote him, do you know up to what point you know? Unquote. Not what do you know, or how do you know that what you know is the truth, which are questions that knowledge asks of itself. But what are the limits of your knowing? The role of critique then is not to dismiss the value of knowledge, to discredit its claim to know, but to point to its limits so that it can think beyond them. Critical work involves a thinking beyond the boundaries that, at any given time and in any given discipline, thought gives to itself. This venture, or should I say adventure, is what I call critical interdisciplinarity. Let me now illustrate my argument with the first of my two examples, Harish's novel, Misha. Misha is a curious fiction of space. It opens with a map of the Kutanad region, which has nothing fictitious about it. In fact, maps pop up in the novel with odd frequency. When a police officer pulls out a map of the region where his fugitive mustache hides, when Avarachan, the owner of Smithies, draws up a map of his house with a surveyor's rule that he himself has fashioned, or hangs on the wall a map of Kumarakam with, quote, the rivers, canals, fields, orchards, churches, temples, and cemeteries marked with different symbols, unquote. When the narrator surveys the fields and waterways of northern Kutanad extending, quote unquote, like a tattered map to the lake. The author's note begins with a geographic view of Kutanad. I quote, a delta region formed of 5 rivers that originate in the Western Ghats and hundreds of tributaries that flow into the longest lake in India, the Vembanad Kyle, which opens into the Arabian Sea near the port of Kochi, unquote. It ends with, quote, his fascination for this land of sticky mud, decaying mangroves, knotted networks of waterways, and endless collections of fields, unquote, as he weaves into it stories of real and fictional persons, of memory and myth. In other words, we have at one extreme the objective representations of Kutanad, its topography, ecology, economy. At the other, we have subjective accounts of how it was to those who inhabited it, those who worked its fields and waterways, and those who sought refuge in its hidden spaces. Nisha is not just about a character, Vavachan or Mustache. It is equally about the space of Kutanad as mapped and as experienced. It is in his lived relation to the fields and waterways and the stories that crisscross this space that Bhavachan, the once insignificant son of Pavian, becomes the mythical Mustache. Jayashree Kalathi, the translator of Misha, writes, and I quote, Harish's use of magic realism reflects the land itself and the lives built and rebuilt on the land. Unquote. To explain how Misha relates to geographical discourse, let me draw on a book by the French philosopher Henri Lefebvre titled The Production of Space. It is a work of philosophical geography and a good example of what I have called critical interdisciplinarity. Lefebvre does not attempt either a synthesis of the insights of philosophy and geography, or even to connect them, but to develop a philosophically oriented critique of geographical knowledge. Geography, in Lefebvre's view, assumes that space is an objectively given entity, a kind of unchanging container in which people and objects exist. And I quote a passage from Lefebvre. Vis-a-vis lived experience, space is neither a mere frame after the fashion of the frame of a painting, nor a form or container of a virtually neutral kind, designed simply to receive what is poured into it. Space is a social morphology, structure. It is to lived experience what form itself is to the living organism, and just as intimately bound up with function and structure. Unquote. Let me now summarize briefly Lefebvre's arguments. Geographical discourse screens out this quality of lived experience of space, transforming it into the abstraction of a map. Spaces are not given to us. They are what we socially produce in the relation we bear to them. They are produced in a process that resembles the production of commodities through human labor, and even at times coincides with it. We can understand this argument if we think of towns and cities, the urban spaces that we produce out of the resources of nature. But what about so-called natural spaces, a game reserve or a nature park, for instance? It is not clear whether these spaces are given by nature or produced by human intervention, because nature and artifice come indissolubly close. What about a forest that has not been touched by human design? the forest we see in a landscape painting or in photographs in the National Geographic. Even they, Lefebvre would argue, are mediated by human effort, not technological but aesthetic. They bear meanings that we attribute to them, such as quote unquote pristine nature, or as a sexist rhetoric would put it, quote unquote virgin lands. Spaces are produced by the technological and cultural interventions we make, by the labor of industry or creative labor, and they never exist as neutral locations out there. As such, spaces have a history that is implicated in the histories of social struggle, of relations of class, caste, and gender, the question of who works the land and who owns its produce. It is thus a part of the history of modes and relations of production, as space is both a social product and a means of production itself. The core of Lefebvre's argument is that space is produced in the interaction of three elements, what he calls, and I quote from him, the representation of space, representational space, and spatial practices. The representation of space is abstract, quote, a homogeneous, clearly demarcated space, unquote, as in a landscape painting, a blueprint, or a map. And I quote a sentence from him, knowledge emerged from a practice and elaborated upon it by a formalization and the application of a logical order, unquote. Representational space, in contrast, is the knowledge of space acquired in everyday life, in the embodied activities that we perform in specific places, at home, in office, in the locality we live in, the city we traverse each day. Quote, in produced space, acts reproduce meanings, even if no particular individual gives an account of them, unquote. Unlike the homogeneous and abstract representation of space, representational space is concrete and heterogeneous. Quote, analogous places, contrasting places, and the places of what has no place or no longer has a place, unquote. Those of you who have read Misha will clearly see echoes of this, of places that no longer exist, not even in human memory. The representation of space and representational space, taken together, are the knowledge we acquire of space, the former discursively and the latter performatively through embodied acts. Spatial practices, correspondingly, are the way we inhabit space in describing and representing it, and in, quote, those activities which mark the earth, leaving traces and organizing gestures and work performed in common, unquote. The production of space has a history because spatial knowledge and practice are always embedded in social relations that change with time. Disciplinary sciences of space, in which Lefebvre includes geography, conceal or suppress the history of this production because it challenges their disciplinary boundaries or threatens, quote, to alter, if not to erase, the specialists' carefully drawn property lines, unquote. To return to Misha, the novel provides two distinct modes of understanding the Kutanad region. One draws on cartographic knowledge, mapping land and waterways both graphically and in description, while the other derives from the lived relation that people bear to this space as they work on the fields, construct bonds, traverse its channels to trade, forage for food, or escape the law. The map, which in India was a colonial tool, marks space as abstract coordinates of lines, while a lived relation to space marks it as places to be remembered. Every place has a story to tell. Misha ends with, the novel ends with a journey down the Bembanad Kayal as the narrator recounts to his son the stories of places, both historical and mythic. It is in his account of this lived relation that Harish brings out the dense social history in which it is embedded. Overlapping feudal and colonial power structures, relations between upper caste landowners and the Chovans and Parayans who toil on the land, between the privileged and the deprived. It is the history of the production of this space. For Kutanad is literally produced through human labor. And I quote from the novel, built by people who came down from the forests in the throes of hunger, who over centuries dug up the lakes and marshes and built bunds to stop the water. Unquote. It is, and I quote again, a history that no one remembers, a place that was built for hard labor and had to be vacated once the labor was done. Unquote. Misha counterposes this history to geographical knowledge of Kutanad in order to point to the limits of that knowledge in understanding space as lived reality. A novel that opens with a map ends up deconstructing it, reading beyond it to spaces that defy abstract representation. Let me now turn to my second example. I will take up the interdisciplinary question in Misha later when I conclude. In 2008, the Supreme Court of India delivered its judgment in a case of leprosy titled Dhirendra Pandua versus the state of Orissa. Pandua had appealed to the court against a decision to disqualify him from a public post that he had contested and won. On 19 September 2003, elections had been held for the Notified Area Council or NAC of Basudevpur in Orissa. And Pandua, along with several others, won the elections. On 30th September, Pandua was elected chairman from among the elected councillors of the NAC. His nearest rival, who lost to him, Surendra Mahanti, then filed a petition with the election tribunal, challenging his election on the ground that he was a leper and was disqualified from contesting by a provision of the Orissa Municipal Act 1950. Section 1614 of the Act held that a person suffering from leprosy is disqualified from contesting municipal elections, while Section 171B held that a person suffering, held that a councillor shall cease to hold office if he becomes a leprosy patient. When the tribunal ruled against Pandua, ordering him to demit office, he appealed to the Orissa High Court to reverse the order as he had been cured of the disease. But it was established by evidence that Pandua had leprosy in 2003 when he had approached the Supreme Court in a matter pertaining to a job in a leprosy organization. He wanted that job. On 20th April 2004, the government of Orissa, on the order of the Supreme Court, had filed an affidavit that complete investigation and treatment had not been provided to Pandua, and therefore they could not say whether he had been cured. The job he was seeking was only for people who continue to have leprosy. And Pandua appealed to the Supreme Court to order the government of Orissa to test him and confirm. The reply of the government, the affidavit that I read out about on 20th April 2004, was that he has not been tested. And therefore it's impossible to say whether he is cured. In its judgment of 2005, in Dhirendra Pandua versus Election Tribunal cum District Judge, the Orissa High Court upheld the tribunal's order and asked Pandua to quit office. Hence, his appeal before the Supreme Court. Examining all the evidence, the Supreme Court ruled that there was no proof that he had been cured by the time of the municipal elections in 2003 and was required under the law to quit office. In the course of deliberation, the court also took up a matter that Pandua's lawyer had hinted at, but had not made a ground for defense. That the provisions of the Orissa Municipal Act 1950 contradicted Article 14 of the Constitution, the fundamental right against discrimination. Article 14 prohibits what in legal parlance is called class legislation. That is, a law or a part of a law that discriminates arbitrarily against a class of persons. The test for determining whether a law is non-discriminatory, as the court explains, is that A, the classification should be based on, quote, some real and substantial distinction, unquote, and B, this distinction should bear, quote, a reasonable and just relation, unquote, to the objective of the law. Now, the classification of some persons as leprosy patients is based on a laboratory test that is objective, not arbitrary, setting them apart from others who are not infected with leprosy. Secondly, such a classification is reasonable, as the purpose of the law is to prevent transmission of disease, which can be achieved by segregating persons with leprosy from others. Therefore, the provisions of Section 16 and 17 of the Orissa Municipal Act would be reasonable and not discriminatory, not class legislation, but if and only if leprosy can be easily transmitted from person to person. That is the most important point. All this seems sound logic, apart from being juridical common sense. But interestingly, the court indulges in a bit of quibbling when it comes to the last point, the transmissibility of leprosy. In an earlier paragraph explaining what leprosy is, the court had cited the Sloan-Dorland Annotated Medical Legal Dictionary, and I quote, leprosy, which is also known as Hansen's disease, is a mildly infectious degenerative disease caused by the microorganism Mycobacterium leprae. This is the definition of leprosy given in that dictionary, which the judgment quotes. In the operative part of the judgment, where it rules that the provisions of the Orissa Municipal Act are not violative of Article 14, the court states, and I quote, being a contagious disease, it can be transmitted via droplets from the nose and mouth during close and frequent contact with untreated infected persons, unquote. Therefore, there is, and I quote again, the danger of its being transmitted to other people from the person affected by the disease, unquote. Or in the present context, from Pandua to the other councillors and the public. I am curious about this terminological shift from mildly infectious to contagious. Do infection and contagion, which refer to the same disease process, mean the same thing? Infection means the entry of disease-causing organisms or pathogens into the individual body. Organisms such as bacteria, virus, fungi, protozoa. Contagion, on the other hand, means the transmission of pathogens from body to body, usually by direct physical contact. Contagion, in other words, is a sign of quote-unquote danger, which is how the court would perhaps characterize Pandua in its relation to the councillors of Basudepur and the public. In fact, as anthropologist Mary Douglas has stated in Purity and Danger, contagion is simultaneously a medical and moral term, with the latter, that is the moral, preceding the former, that is the medical, in historical usage. She writes, and I quote, We find that certain moral values are upheld and certain social rules defined by beliefs in dangerous contagion, unquote. Beliefs in dangerous contagion. Two words that are emphatic in the court's indictment of Pandua. In risk and blame, I'm sorry, the idea of contagion is thus a powerful instrument in the maintenance of social order, which must expel anything or anyone that threatens it. In Risk and Blame, another book in which he takes up the idea of dangerous contagion, Douglas writes, and I quote, the leper's diseased body was the reprehensible metaphor of social disorder. But much more than a metaphor, leprosy was credited with dangerous effects that had to be controlled. Read in this light, the court's meaning unfolds in the gap between comprehension and apprehension, or understanding and fear, that shapes our cultural response to disease. But it is the final paragraph that clinches my point. And I'm reading out the final paragraph in that judgment. Dhirendra Pandua versus State of Orissa, Supreme Court, 2008. Before parting with this case, we deem it appropriate to point out that having regard to the changed concept and knowledge gained about the disease of leprosy, on the recommendation of the working group on eradication of leprosy appointed by the government of India, many state governments and union territories have repealed the antiquated Lepers Act 1898 and subsequent similar state acts, providing for the segregation and medical treatment of pauper lepers suffering from infectious type of disease. Therefore, in keeping in view the present thinking and researches carried out on leprosy as also on tuberculosis, and with professional input, the legislature may seriously consider whether it is still necessary to retain such provisions in the statute. To put it simply, current medical wisdom holds that leprosy is not easily transmitted, that there is no reason for segregating persons with leprosy as sources of danger, and that the Orissa Municipal Act 1950 needs to be amended with regard to Section 1614 and 17(1)(b), which are unreasonable and unjust. In the earlier paragraph, it had ruled that these sections, and I quote, are not violative of Article 14 of the Constitution, unquote. In this paragraph, it all but states that they are. What unfolds? Apart from the juridical truism that a law is good unless proved otherwise, is a rationality, a reason of the law that confounds itself even as it reiterates the dogmas that found it, or the boundaries that mark what is proper and what improper to the disciplinary discourse of jurisprudence. It shows how jurisprudence is a discipline in Foucault's double sense, a domain of knowledge and a technique of control, each acting in support of the other. Is Pandua then a bad decision? Deficit in the principle of law? No. For a decision is legal if it follows what is laid down as law. As the court puts it, quote, the legislature, in its wisdom, has thought it fit to retain such a provision. This is in the second last paragraph, unquote. Courts do not make laws. They merely adjudicate on laws made by the legislature. But is it a just decision? In his essay, Force of Law, Jacques Derrida argues that law and justice are incompatible. And I quote from the essay, if I were content to apply a just rule without a spirit of justice and without in some way inventing the rule and the example for each case, I might be protected by law, my action corresponding to objective law. but I would not be just. A decision based on a legal norm cannot attend to the singularity of a case that does not entirely coincide with the norm. To do so, to render justice to that singularity, it must suspend the norm. Pandwa upholds both a legal and a moral norm. Legal in that courts must enforce the law, and moral in that bodies that are dangerous must be set outside the social order. This must be so, even if the bodies in question may not, in fact, be a source of danger. Our reading of the Pandwa judgment follows the method of the humanities, not of jurisprudence. It examines not questions of law or questions of fact, but the way a judgment as text produces the meanings it expresses and enforces. Judgments, as jurist Robert Cover states in an essay called Violence and the Word, judgments are texts in the public domain, like poetry, drama, or fiction. But unlike literary texts, which are open only to the risk of an unjust interpretation, judgments have material effects on the people they adjudicate. And I'd like to quote a very eloquent sentence from Cover's essay. The judges deal with pain and death. By reading Dhirendra Pandwa versus the state of Orissa, as we would a literary text, by asking the questions that jurisprudence prohibits, we open up to critique the limits of law's knowledge in its goal of rendering justice. But what about our reading of Nisha? What critical insight does it offer, except as a way of reading a novel through geography and of reading geography through a novel? Nisha, I have argued, points to the limits of cartographic objectivity and to its suppressed links with power. The limit case for this critique is the refugee, whose existence is founded on a deeply ambiguous relation to a space defined by maps. The refugee inhabits a cruel paradox, a double negation. He lives in a land to which he does not belong and belongs to a land he can no longer live in. The map for him marks the lines of this paradox. Like Mustache, the fugitive, the refugee must always be on the run, one step ahead of the law of lines that must fix him to a space, either the country from which he fled or a camp in his country of refuge. Excuse me. Let me introduce here another story of humanity and space. Deep Haldar's Blood Island is an ethnographic narrative about Bangladeshi refugees who were forcibly evicted from an island in the Sundarbans that they had made their home. They had escaped from the refugee camps in Dandakaranya because they wanted a place they could call their home. Morijhapi, the island, reminded them of the home to which they had belonged before they were forced to flee from it. In January 1979, about a year after they settled Morijhapi, the government of West Bengal blockaded the island, killed those who protested, and forced the others to return to the camps. Survivors of the Morijhapi massacre claim that 5 to 10,000 people died, while the government considered less than 10 deaths. Blood Island foregrounds the precarious existence of the refugee who must set up a home in the gap between the inscriptions of geography, maps, and its imagination as lived reality, between the map's objectivity and the refugee's subjective relation to land. Geography, to be a human knowledge, must acknowledge this precarity. Blood Island too opens with a map. Let me conclude my talk with a question that the philosopher Henri Atlan asks of the human sciences. And I quote Atlan: how can scientific objectivity be comfortable with objects of research from which subjectivity cannot be banished? This, I think, is the pertinent question that interdisciplinarity as critical practice asks in interfacing the human sciences with the humanities, not, as I have said, in order to discredit them, but to provoke them beyond the limits they set. Thank you. I hope I am have not taken up too much of time.
No, sir. Thank you, Dilip sir, for providing such an insightful overview on the theme of the conference itself. The beginning is the most important part of the work, says Plato, and we have to agree with him. This was indeed an immediate start, which would be followed by other keynote speakers who will be dealing with other aspects of interdisciplinarity. I'm sure that this talk has triggered a lot of questions. So, dear participants, you can either unmute yourself and speak, which will be preferred, or you can type the questions in the chat box.
While people are formulating their questions and comments, uh, may I request Rose Sebastian, or Dr. Rose Sebastian, I'm sorry. May I request Dr. Rose Sebastian to speak briefly about her work. I didn't have the time to talk about that, but her work on the museum, which I think is an excellent example of critical interdisciplinarity. I mean, that was one of the theses that I supervised, where actually Rose and I were really working with something that we had simply theorized. So briefly, Rose could talk about that. Maybe that would connect with what I have said. And
So I began looking at the museum with the Foucauldian assumption that Sir had mentioned in the beginning of the talk, that every discipline emerged at a certain historical point to cater to the political and social requirements of that age. Looking from that perspective, we can say that the museum did not exist from time immemorial, from the very beginning. It comes in a certain form in Europe because of certain political changes that must have taken place. We all know that the prototypes of museum must have been private collections and menageries owned by the knowledgeable and the rich and the aristocratic. And at some point in Europe's history, it becomes a public space. To be specific, it is in the post-French Revolution period when the idea of public and democracy comes in, that these private spaces and objects were made accessible to the public. So I begin by looking at the history of the European Museum, and then I come to the Indian context, where we did not have that kind of a democratic transformation happening to the institution of museum, but we had it imported from Europe in the form of colonial museum. But then the perspective was different. The colonial museum was fraught with all kinds of epistemological dangers of the Occident looking at the Orient, and there was a lot of social Darwinism involved in it. And from the tribal museum, which I took up the Indian Museum in Calcutta as a case study of the of the colonial museum. And after a century or so, after India became independent in 1947, there was a lot of initiative to set up the India's first national museum in New Delhi. And there's a continuity of the discourse. At the same time, there's certain major ruptures with the discourse of the colonial museum as we set up our first national museum, because as Kavita Singh says, a nation needs not just national flag and national anthem, we need a national museum, because we are trying to represent ourselves in front of the whole world. There's a young new democracy born a couple of years ago, and we want to be we want to represent ourselves in front of the world. So a lot of deliberation and calculation have gone into the making of the first National Museum. So I take up the history of the establishment of the National Museum as a case study. From there on, I move on to various types of museums like the Science Museum, the Museum of Democracy, the Tribal Museum, to represent certain phases in the evolution of India as a nation state. So basically, the concept is that museum, which is usually the object of study of museology, uh, is taken up into the perspective of critical humanities. Someone who studies museology or someone who studies archaeology doesn't approach their object of study with a critical perspective. But when we approach a museum or an artifact from a critical perspective, beyond its antiquity, beyond its beauty, beyond its archaeological features, a lot of things become evident that are political calculation, why certain histories are excluded, why certain histories are displayed with a lot of prominence. For instance, if you go to the National Museum, you wouldn't find there anything from the Northeast, for instance, or from the Islamic period of India's history. But you will see that a lot of thrust is given upon the Gupta period, the Maurya period, for certain reasons. So we are reading into the power equations that belie the culture of a display. So that was what my object. So I think the interdisciplinarity was in the fact that I was looking at the object of museology, the object of archaeology, from the perspective of political analysis. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
sir.
Yes, ma'am.
Professor Das, I really enjoyed your insightful talk and enjoyed the examples, the illustrations that you have given to explain interdisciplinarity. I would like to connect Kutanad and the story, the novel that you have talked about with Hungry Tide by Amitav Ghosh.
Yes, yes, certainly.
I could relate that towards the end of your talk when you mentioned about Mori Japi and Sundarbans, where this was located. And it also talks about the refugees who moved from Dandakaranya to Sundarbans and Mori Japi Island, where the refugee undergo the crisis. I was also looking at the precarious existence of the refugees there and also the cultural geography. Recently, I did a work on this book. I applied the notion of cultural geography and how to make spaces, how the refugees make spaces and cultural interaction, how it happens when they make spaces. I was applying this interdisciplinary theory of geography and cultural geographers to study this text. Is there any comment on this?
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Yes, sir, most certainly it is. In fact, Amitav Ghosh has a peculiarity, since that he belongs to the human sciences. His training was in anthropology, and he's an excellent anthropologist. And he writes his novels researching his subjects heavily, as an anthropologist would do.
Yes.
So there's still the anthropologist in him, and there is the novelist in him, an objectivist discourse and the subjective experience. And I see Amitav Ghosh as a very interesting confluence of two different modes of perceiving the world. Perceiving the world through the objective discourse of the human sciences, perceiving the world through the subjective discourse of the humanities.
Yes.
I think Ghosh represents precisely that kind of critical interface between the humanities and the human sciences that we've been talking about. And it would be very interesting to look at any of his novels. Hungry Tide is one of my favorite novels. I must have read it maybe 7, 8 times, even though it's a fat book. I didn't like the other one, the one that followed Gun Island, as much as The Hungry Tide. But I think we can actually read that. Any of his novels. You take Calcutta Chromosome. You take Calcutta Chromosome. Objectivist history on the one side, and fantasy and myth on the other. The subjectivism of fantasy and myths on the other. So Amitav Ghosh is certainly very, very important in that he combines in his writing
Yes.
both modes.
Yes.
You know, each kind of pointing to the limits of the other. And I think that was very insightful of you to actually discover this, which I've not read much secondary material on The Hungry Tide, but I don't think there would have been much written on this. This is possibly something that needs further exploration as a kind of instance of critical interdisciplinarity. Since you've been interested in the question of the refugee, and I think you should read this book. It's not a novel, it's a journalistic account. Deep Haldar is a journalist, spelled Deephaldar, and the book is called Blood Island.
Okay.
It's a fascinating book about, I mean, the way I read the book is that it was all about the human relation to space. How does one understand space? How does one try to make a homely space in an unhomely land?
Yes.
In what ways do we need to reimagine space away from the objectivity of maps and of national borders? And I think therein lies a very, very ethical, a very humane insight that we, by working on books like The Hungry Tide, Blood Island, that we may be able to bring out to the fore. That is an ethical responsibility. The humanities only can fulfill, not the human sciences. Excellent, excellent.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Wonderful.
I'm yet to read Blood Island, but when you when you made a reference towards the end, I could connect it with The Hungry Tide.
Yeah.
It's more or less similar, the accounts that you talked about.
Yes.
And I looked at it from the cultural geography point of view, rather than from environmental perspectives.
Yeah, cultural geography is actually, that's an example of interdisciplinary work, is working with subjective ideas of space. You know, there's some very interesting work done in cultural geography on the difference between space and place.
Yes.
The concepts of space and place. And cultural geography draws quite heavily on the work of Henri Lefebvre on the book, The Production of Space. So, yeah, cultural geography is moving towards that direction. But I would still not call it a critical interdisciplinarity, because the objective of cultural geography is not to point to the limits of geographical knowledge. It is to make a connection between the notion of culture in the humanities and the notion of space in the human sciences. It would be an instance of what Richards calls interdisciplinarity or interdisciplinary connection. But it would not be an instance of what I call critical interdisciplinarity, which has a very different task from the task of interdisciplinarity as Richards thinks of it. The task of critical interdisciplinarity is to bring out what has been called the politics of knowledge, the power relations within which knowledges are embedded, and to provoke knowledge to think beyond itself.
Yes, sir. That's a new insight, sir. Thank you.
I guess, are there any more questions? Okay, sir, Dilip sir,
Yes.
there are no other.
It's difficult to respond right away. Yeah.
Okay. Sir, actually, Professor Dilip K. Das is here with us by putting aside some very, very urgent personal matter. Sir, it was so kind of you to do that. Academic excellence, commitment, and kindness. That is actually quite a rare sight to behold. On behalf of the Department of English, Bharat Mata College, I extend a very hearty thanks to you, sir, and we look forward to have further deliberations with you. And we are so happy that Rose couldn't resist to take your course. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful interaction. And yeah.
Actually, it was our privilege, sir.
Oh, well, it's a privilege in which we share.
Thank you, sir, for those words. Thank you, Jay, sir, for being our constant companion, and Chitra ma'am for making us feel royal, and our deep sense of appreciation for those who have been here with us. Hope you will enjoy the upcoming sessions too. The next session will start at 11:30 a.m.
Ma'am, we can start the next session right now. Prantik Banerjee is available, has already joined. So
Okay.
if we restart the meeting, then people may not join, or they may get busy.
Sir, may I just button a little bit? Since we have told the people that the session is at 11:30, I think the people may have planned it that way. So I think it is better to keep the time because many of the people may be interested in listening, and I think it will